all the timber.
Yeah, looks alive.
Carl Powell had dedicated 12 years of his life to the United States Coast Guard, a tenure served entirely at the Coos Bay Station, a rugged outpost clinging to the southern Oregon coast. In all those years, through countless gales and winter squalls that churned the Pacific into a gray fury, he had never witnessed a storm of this magnitude. It descended on that November afternoon, not as weather, but as a malevolent entity. The sky, a canvas of bruised purples and blacks stitched together with veins of sickly gray, seemed to press down on the world, suffocating the light. The wind, an unseen beast, came screaming across the open ocean, its voice a high, thin shriek that rattled the thick-paned windows of the station and sent unsecured equipment skittering and tumbling across the wet concrete of the yard like frightened animals. For 3 days, the Weather Service had tracked the system, their reports growing more dire with each passing hour. They watched it coalesce from a disorganized disturbance into a cyclonic behemoth, a swirling vortex of low pressure that fed on the ocean's warmth, building in strength as it churned inexorably toward the coastline. By the time it made landfall, the waves were already a monstrous marching army, their crests frothing at 20 feet. The forecasts, grim and unyielding, predicted they would climb higher still, reaching heights that would test the limits of man and machine. Inside the operations room, the air was thick with tension and the smell of ozone from the humming electronics. Carl stood alongside his crew, a silent observer before the glowing altars of technology. On the radar screens, pulsing bands of green, yellow, and angry arterial red swept across the map, a visual representation of the chaos unfolding outside. The emergency channels crackled and spat with static-filled distress calls, the fragmented voices of fishermen caught too far from the sanctuary of the harbor, their small vessels now playthings for the storm's fury. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Brennan, a woman whose calm demeanor was as legendary as her seamanship, orchestrated the response. Her voice, measured and clear despite the symphony of destruction outside, cut through the noise, a beacon of order in a world descending into chaos. She triaged the calls, dispatching the available crews to the most critical situations, a grim calculus of life and death. Carl's team was assigned to the motor lifeboat 47-225, a 47-foot vessel that was the station's workhorse, a marvel of engineering designed specifically for operations in the most punishing of seas. It was a boat built to be rolled by waves and right itself, to punch through walls of water, to go out when every sane instinct screamed to stay in. Carl had made this run dozens of times, a familiar dance with death in the storm-tossed Pacific. He had pulled half-frozen fishermen from the decks of disabled boats, their faces masks of terror and gratitude. He had towed battered vessels back to the safety of port, a slow, painstaking battle against the relentless sea. He had searched the black, churning waters for survivors in conditions that would have broken the will of most people, the powerful searchlights cutting futile swaths through the darkness. The crew assembled in the equipment room with a practiced efficiency born of years of shared danger. The ritual was always the same, a series of deliberate actions that pushed back the fear. They pulled on their bright orange dry suits over their uniforms, the neoprene stiff and cold at first. They meticulously checked the seals at their wrists, ankles, and neck, ensuring everything was watertight. In water this cold, a leak was a death sentence. Hypothermia could steal a man's life in a matter of minutes. Carl's teammates were more than colleagues. They were brothers forged in the crucible of the storm. He trusted each of them with his life, a faith reaffirmed every time they left the harbor's embrace for the open ocean. There was Derek Simmons, the boat's engineer, a stocky, unflappable man from the landlocked mountains of Idaho. Derek possessed a mechanical genius that bordered on the supernatural, capable of coaxing a dead engine back to life with little more than duct tape, a wrench, and sheer, bloody-minded determination. Martin Fisher, served as the navigator, a quiet, thoughtful man from Wisconsin whose calm exterior concealed a mind that could read the ocean's moods like a scholar reading an ancient text. He had an almost uncanny ability to find the safest passage through the most impossible conditions, to see the patterns in the chaos. And then there was young Tommy Vasquez, the newest member of the team. At just 23, he was a bundle of eager energy and raw talent, his skills undeniable but still unseasoned by the hard, bitter lessons that only experience could teach. He looked to the older men with a mixture of awe and a desperate desire to prove his worth. They launched the motor lifeboat into a maelstrom. The conditions were beyond treacherous, pushing the very limits of what even the most seasoned Coast Guard crews considered acceptable. The vessel, a titan in the calm waters of the bay, was reduced to a cork in the tumultuous ocean. It slammed down into the troughs between waves with bone-jarring force, the impacts shuddering through the reinforced hull, and then clawed its way up the faces of swells that towered over them like moving liquid mountains of dark, angry water. The rain was not falling. It was driven horizontally, a liquid barrage propelled by winds that screamed and howled across the surface of the sea, reducing visibility to a claustrophobic curtain of grey despite the powerful sweeping beams of the searchlights mounted on the boat. Carl stood at the helm, his hands gripping the wheel, his knuckles white. He felt every shudder, every groan, every violent impact as the boat fought its relentless battle against the storm, his eyes fixed on the glowing coordinates provided by dispatch. The last known position of a fishing vessel, the Sea Serpent, which had lost power and was drifting inexorably toward the jagged rocks that lined the coast. It took them over an hour to find the stricken boat, a ghost ship wallowing helplessly in the heavy seas, its lights dark, its crew huddled in the wheelhouse, their faces pale in the intermittent glare of Carl's searchlight. The rescue that followed was 90 minutes of pure, hellish exertion, a brutal ballet performed on a pitching stage in conditions that would later revisit Carl in the quiet hours of the night, replaying in his dreams for weeks to come. Finally, after multiple failed attempts that saw lines snap and men nearly swept overboard, they secured a tow line. The journey back toward the protected waters of the bay began, a slow, dangerous crawl against the storm's unabated fury. The sun, a forgotten memory, was setting somewhere beyond the thick shroud of storm clouds, bleeding the world of its remaining color, turning everything to shades of gray, and a deeper, more profound gray. It was then that the radio crackled to life with a new transmission, a voice that cut through the static and made every man in the wheelhouse fall silent and still. The voice belonged to the pilot of a Coast Guard Jayhawk helicopter, which had been conducting a search pattern further north. It was tight, strained, laced with an undercurrent of something that sounded like confusion or perhaps sheer disbelief. He reported spotting what he could only describe as a person, clinging to a large piece of debris approximately 8 miles offshore. The sighting was bizarre. It was in an area where no vessels had been reported missing, where no distress calls had been received. The helicopter, powerful as it was, could not attempt a rescue. The winds were too violent, making it far too dangerous to lower a rescue basket. The pilot's voice was firm on this point. It had to be a boat crew. They needed someone on the water to investigate and retrieve whoever or whatever was out there, alone in the heart of the storm. Lieutenant Commander Brennan's voice came through the radio a moment later, crisp and authoritative, issuing new orders. Carl's crew was to hand off the tow of the Sea Serpent to another boat being dispatched from the station and proceed immediately to the coordinates the helicopter had provided. Carl acknowledged the transmission, his voice betraying none of the apprehension that coiled in his stomach. He watched as another MLB appeared through the rain and spray to take over the tow, a brief exchange of professional nods across the churning water. Then he altered course, pushing the motor lifeboat northwest, away from the relative safety of the coastline, out into the open ocean where the storm's full, unobstructed power could be brought to bear. The waves had grown to a monstrous 25 feet by the time they reached the search area. They were no longer waves, but massive, rolling mountains of water, colossal liquid ranges that lifted the 47-foot boat high into the screaming wind on their crests, offering a terrifying panoramic view of the chaos, before dropping it into deep, silent valleys where, for a heart-stopping moment, the wind would disappear entirely, a deceptive calm before it returned with renewed, roaring violence. Martin stood beside Carl at the navigation station, his eyes glued to the screens, calling out course corrections in a steady voice, watching the GPS coordinates tick closer and closer to the location the helicopter had reported. On the deck, secured by thick safety lines that were their only connection to the boat, Derek and Tommy manned the searchlights, their bodies braced against the rolling deck, sweeping the impenetrable darkness with powerful beams that barely seemed to pierce the curtain of rain and spray. It was Tommy who spotted it first. His young voice, cracking with a mixture of excitement and strain, shouted above the gale, his arm pointing off the port bow toward a dark shape that rose and fell with the swells. Carl maneuvered the boat with painstaking care, fighting to maintain control as the MLB rolled and pitched violently, bringing the full force of the searchlights to bear on the object in the storm-tossed water. What they saw, illuminated in the harsh, sterile white beams, made no sense. It was an image so incongruous, so utterly impossible, that for a long moment the human brain simply refused to process it. There was debris, as the pilot had reported. It was a massive section of what looked like an old dock or a pier, weathered wooden planks held together by thick, creosote-blackened beams, riding the waves like a crude, makeshift raft. But clinging to that debris was something that could not possibly be there, something that belonged to the realm of campfire stories and grainy, out-of-focus photographs shared on internet conspiracy forums. It was huge, far larger than any human being, with arms as thick as tree trunks wrapped around one of the central beams, its grip seemingly unbreakable. Its body was covered entirely in a thick coat of dark, matted hair that hung in wet, heavy clumps, streaming water as the makeshift raft crested each massive swell. Carl's first thought, the rational, trained part of his mind desperately scrambling for a logical explanation, was that it had to be a bear. A large black bear, perhaps, somehow swept out to sea during the storm, clinging to the debris in a desperate, primal bid for survival. But as the searchlight held steady on the figure, as the boat drew closer and the impossible details sharpened into focus, that explanation crumbled away like sand washed away by the surf. The proportions were all wrong for a bear. The limbs were too long, the torso too broad and upright, even in its hunched position. And then the creature turned its head toward the light. When Carl saw the face, caught in that brilliant, unforgiving beam, his blood ran cold in a way that had nothing to do with the biting November wind or the frigid ocean spray. The face was not human, but it was not entirely animal either. It was something caught in an impossible evolutionary limbo between the two. A heavy, protruding brow ridge shadowed deep-set eyes that reflected the searchlight with a disturbing amber glow. The nose was broad and flat, the jaw massive and powerful. The expression on that face, as it stared at the approaching boat, was one of pure, primitive terror. The creature opened its mouth, and a sound cut through the howl of the wind, a scream that was neither human nor beast, a chilling vocalization that carried notes of fear, rage, and something else, something ancient and wild that Carl could not identify, but which made his stomach clench with a deep instinctive dread. Derek's voice, shaking slightly, came from the deck, transmitted through the headset. "What the hell is that thing? Carl, what is that?" Carl had no answer. His mind was still refusing to accept the evidence of his own eyes, still cycling through a Rolodex of failed explanations. But there was no explanation. There was no logical reason for what clung to that debris 8 miles offshore in the middle of a hurricane-force storm. The creature was real. It was there. It was looking directly at them with those glowing amber eyes, and every instinct in Carl's body, every primal alarm bell inherited from a million years of evolution, was screaming at him to turn the boat around and flee as fast as the twin diesel engines would push them. But they were the United States Coast Guard. They had taken an oath to render aid to those in distress upon the sea, an oath that made no distinction between man or beast, or this. Whatever this creature was, it was clearly in desperate trouble, clinging to a piece of wreckage in seas that would eventually tear it loose and drag it down into the crushing black depths. Carl made the decision in a split second, a choice born of duty and training that overrode his terror. He knew, even as he gave the orders, that he might be making the most terrible mistake of his life. He keyed his mic, his voice steadier than he felt, telling Derek and Tommy to prepare for a rescue operation, to get the rescue net ready, to approach the debris from the downwind side, where they would have the most control. The motor lifeboat edged closer, its engines straining to maintain position against the powerful wind and current. In the relentless glare of the searchlights, Carl could see the creature more clearly now. It was massive, easily 8 or 9 feet tall, even in its hunched, clinging posture. Its shoulders were immense, at least 4 feet across. The hair covering its body was a dark brown or black, thick and coarse, hanging in heavy, waterlogged ropes. Its hands were enormous, with fingers as thick as sausages wrapped around the wooden beam, and Carl could see the powerful muscles bunching and flexing beneath the soaked fur as the creature shifted its grip with the violent motion of each passing wave. The smell hit them when they were within 30 feet, a stench so overwhelming, so viscerally foul, that Tommy, despite his dry suit and the hours of desensitization training, bent over the rail and vomited into the churning sea. It was the smell of death and decay, of things rotting in dark, damp places, of spoiled meat and animal waste, and a potent, musky odor, all combined into a reek so powerful it seemed to have a physical presence, an invisible cloud that invaded the nostrils and throat and lungs. Carl's eyes watered and his stomach heaved, but he kept his hands steady on the controls, inching the boat closer, his gaze locked on the creature, which watched them with those intelligent amber eyes that seemed to hold a knowledge that was deeply, fundamentally wrong. Derek and Tommy, recovering quickly, deployed the rescue net. It was a large mesh basket that could be lowered into the water and then winched back aboard, designed for retrieving people who were too injured, exhausted, or hypothermic to climb a ladder. The plan was simple, at least in theory. Get the net into the water close enough for the creature to grab onto or climb into, then winch both the net and its occupant out of the water and onto the deck. Once it was aboard, they could render aid and try to figure out what in God's name they were dealing with. The creature, however, had other ideas. As the net splashed into the water beside the debris, as Derek, falling back on his training, called out words of encouragement in the standard phrases used for all water rescues, the creature's entire demeanor shifted in an instant. The raw terror that had been visible in its posture and on its face transformed into something else entirely, something aggressive, hostile, and terrifyingly violent. It released its death grip on the wooden beam and lunged toward the boat with a speed and agility that seemed impossible for something so large. Its mouth opened to release another of those terrible, soul-shaking screams, and its long arms reached out with clear, hostile intent. The debris tilted dangerously as the creature's immense weight shifted, and for a heart-stopping moment, Carl thought it would fall into the water. Instead, it used the tilting platform as a springboard, launching itself toward the motor lifeboat. It covered the distance in a single powerful leap that should have been physically impossible, a feat of raw power that defied the laws of physics. The creature hit the side of the boat with a tremendous, shuddering impact, its massive hands gripping the steel rail, its weight causing the entire vessel to heel over at a dangerous angle. In the wheelhouse, Martin was thrown across the deck, slamming into the bulkhead with a sharp cry of pain. Carl fought the controls, desperately trying to compensate for the sudden, violent shift in balance, but the creature was already climbing, pulling its massive frame up and over the rail with those impossibly strong arms. The stench intensified, so overpowering that Carl's vision blurred from the tears streaming from his eyes. Tommy was closest to the point where the creature came aboard. He made a fatal mistake, a mistake born of youth, inexperience, and a good heart. Instead of backing away to safety, he reached out, as if to help, to steady the thing. The creature's hand shot out faster than Carl's eyes could follow. Those massive fingers, thick and powerful, closed around Tommy's arm just above the elbow. Even over the shriek of the wind, Carl heard the sickening, explosive crack of bone breaking, a sound like a gunshot. Tommy screamed, a high, thin sound of pure, unadulterated agony. The creature jerked him forward with casual, effortless strength, lifting the young man completely off the deck, as if he weighed nothing more than a child's doll. Derek was shouting, his mouth moving, but the words were lost in the cacophony of the storm and Tommy's screams. Then Derek was diving, not away, but toward the equipment locker where they kept the distress flares and other emergency gear. The creature, with a flick of its wrist, hurled Tommy across the deck. The young man's body hit the far rail with a sickening, wet thud before tumbling over the side and disappearing into the black, churning water below. Carl, his mind reeling, abandoned the controls and lunged for the radio. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely key the microphone. He was screaming into it, a frantic, incoherent stream of words. "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday," giving their position, trying to describe what was happening even as the words sounded insane, coming from his own mouth. The motor lifeboat was wallowing now, beam on to the waves without a hand at the helm. A large swell hit them broadside, sending a cascade of green water across the deck. The creature seemed utterly unconcerned by the deluge, maintaining its balance with an ease that spoke of a deep, primal familiarity with this violent environment. It turned its attention from the spot where Tommy had vanished and fixed its gaze on Carl. Those amber eyes were full of a cold, intelligent rage and something else that looked terrifyingly like hunger. It took a step forward, and the steel deck plates groaned under its immense weight. In that moment of terrible proximity, Carl could see details that his mind would catalogue and carry with him forever. The way the water ran in rivulets from the matted fur, the network of pale scars that crossed the creature's torso, the yellowed, formidable teeth visible behind pulled-back lips, the fingers tipped with thick black nails that were almost claws. Derek emerged from the equipment locker, a flare gun clutched in his hands. He didn't hesitate. He pointed the weapon at the creature and fired point-blank into its chest. The flare struck the creature square in the sternum and ignited with a brilliant, searing red light. The phosphorus, burning at thousands of degrees, ate into flesh and fur. The creature's scream this time was pure, unadulterated pain, a sound so loud and terrible that Carl felt it vibrate in his bones. It staggered backward, clawing at the burning flare embedded in its chest, and Derek, wasting no time, fired again. This shot caught the creature in the shoulder, adding a second point of searing, agonizing light to the first. But the pain, instead of driving the creature off the boat, seemed to enrage it further, stripping away any remaining vestige of fear and leaving only pure, murderous fury. It charged at Derek with terrifying speed, ignoring the burning flares. Derek tried to dodge, but on the pitching, water-slick deck there was nowhere to go. The creature caught him with one sweeping arm. The impact lifted Derek completely off his feet and sent him crashing into the wheelhouse window. The reinforced safety glass shattered into 1,000 pieces, and Derek disappeared through the opening, his body landing somewhere inside the wheelhouse with a heavy, final thud. Carl was moving on pure instinct, years of training taking over where conscious thought had failed. He grabbed the emergency axe from its mount on the bulkhead and raised it, a pathetically small weapon against such a monstrous foe, as the creature turned back toward him. The motor lifeboat rolled with another wave, and Carl's feet slipped on the wet deck, but he kept his grip on the axe. He knew it was his only weapon. He knew he was probably going to die in the next few seconds, but he was determined to go down fighting. Then the boat heaved violently, struck by a rogue wave, larger than the others. The creature lost its footing for a fraction of a second, its massive arms windmilling for balance. Carl saw his chance. He swung the axe with all his strength, aiming for the creature's torso, but his own footing was unstable. The blow went wide, the axe blade glancing off the creature's shoulder instead of biting deep. It was enough to draw blood, though. A dark line appeared where the blade had cut through fur and skin. The creature roared again, that terrible sound of rage and pain, and backhanded Carl across the face with a casual, dismissive violence. The world exploded into a starburst of white, then faded to black, then swam back into a painful grey reality. Carl found himself on his back on the deck, his face a mask of throbbing pain. He could taste the coppery tang of blood in his mouth from where his teeth had cut the inside of his cheek. He could feel the cold water soaking through his dry suit where the deck plates were awash, and he realized with a distant, detached surprise that he was still alive, still conscious. The creature was moving away from him toward the stern of the boat. For a fleeting, hopeful moment, Carl thought it was leaving, that perhaps he had hurt it enough to drive it off. But then he saw what the creature was looking at, and a new, colder horror replaced the old one. There were more of them in the water. Carl could see them clearly in the sweeping beams of the searchlights that still blazed from the boat's superstructure. They were massive, dark shapes, swimming through the towering waves with powerful fluid strokes, their heads breaking the surface to reveal faces identical to the one that had climbed aboard, their amber eyes glowing in the light. There were at least 4 of them, maybe more, moving through the water as if they belonged there, as if the storm-tossed ocean was their natural home. They were converging on the motor lifeboat from multiple directions. The creature on the deck made a sound different from its screams of rage and pain. It was a series of deep, coughing barks that carried across the water. The swimming creatures answered with similar vocalizations. With a sickening certainty, Carl realized they were communicating, coordinating, working together with an intelligence that made them infinitely more dangerous than any simple animal. The creature on the deck moved to the stern rail and, without hesitation, dove off the boat, vanishing into a swell with barely a splash. Carl was alone on the deck with the wind and the rain and the terrifying knowledge that something far worse was about to happen. He pulled himself to his feet, using the rail for support, his head spinning from the blow. He staggered toward the shattered wheelhouse where Martin and Derek had disappeared. The interior was a wreck. Shards of glass covered everything, and equipment torn loose from its mounts littered the deck. Martin was crawling slowly toward the radio, his left arm hanging at an unnatural angle, clearly broken. Derek lay motionless near the navigator's station, his head bent at an angle that was sickeningly wrong, an angle that meant death. Carl felt something inside him crack at the sight of his friend's lifeless body. But there was no time for grief. The boat was rocking violently now, not from the waves, but from something else, from a series of powerful rhythmic impacts against the hull. The creatures were hitting the boat from below, powerful, deliberate strikes that shook the entire vessel. Carl could hear the tortured groan of metal under stress. He reached Martin and helped him to his feet. Together, they stumbled to the radio. Martin was trying to speak, but blood kept welling up in his mouth, making his words a wet, unintelligible gurgle. The radio was still working, a miracle. Carl grabbed the microphone and gave their position again, his voice raw with desperation. He shouted that they were under attack, that they needed immediate assistance, that Tommy was in the water, that Derek was dead, that there were creatures, multiple creatures. He knew he sounded insane, but he didn't care because it was all true, every last impossible word of it. The voice that answered was Lieutenant Commander Brennan. She was asking questions, her professional calm strained, trying to understand, telling him that help was on the way, but her words sounded distant and unimportant compared to the immediate, terrifying reality of their situation. Another impact, harder than the others, and this time Carl heard the unmistakable, catastrophic sound of the hull breaching, metal tearing like paper, followed by the roar of water rushing in. The motor lifeboat listed suddenly and sharply to port, the deck tilting at an angle that could only mean catastrophic damage. Carl knew with absolute certainty that the boat was sinking, that the creatures had torn a hole through the reinforced hull, that they had maybe 2 minutes, if that, before the ocean claimed the vessel entirely. He pulled Martin toward the door, toward the deck, toward the life raft mounted in its quick-release container amidships. They made it maybe 3 steps before the boat rolled completely, the port rail dipping under, green water flooding across the deck and pouring through the shattered wheelhouse windows. Carl lost his grip on Martin, lost his footing, felt the world turn sideways as the motor lifeboat capsized. Then he was in the water. The cold was a physical blow, a shock that stole his breath despite the dry suit. The waves closed over his head, pulling him down into the suffocating darkness. He fought his way back to the surface, his lungs burning, and broke through into a world of air and spray and howling wind. The motor lifeboat was on its side, its keel and propellers exposed, the hull visible in the searchlights that still blazed underwater, creating an eerie, spectral green glow beneath the surface. He saw Martin clinging to a section of railing that was still above water, his face a white mask of shock and pain. Carl swam toward him, a desperate, exhausting struggle against the current and waves. He reached the capsized boat and grabbed the same railing, pulling himself partially out of the water, gasping for air. That was when he saw Tommy, or what was left of him. He wished immediately, with every fiber of his being, that he had not looked. The young man was floating face down 20 feet away, his bright orange dry suit torn completely open from chest to waist. The water around him was dark with blood that looked black in the unearthly glow of the underwater searchlights. As Carl watched, frozen with horror, one of the creatures surfaced next to Tommy's body. It grabbed the corpse with both hands and with a casual, horrifying ease, pulled it under, dragging it down into the depths like a crocodile taking its prey. Martin was screaming now, a raw, silent scream, his mouth open, the cords in his neck standing out, but the sound was devoured by the wind. Then another creature surfaced right next to him, so close that Carl could have reached out and touched it. In the eerie underwater light, he got a clear, unobstructed look at the thing's face. He saw the water streaming from the matted fur, saw the amber eyes lock onto Martin with a cold, predatory focus, saw the mouth open to reveal teeth designed for tearing flesh. The creature reached out almost gently and placed one massive hand on top of Martin's head. Then it pushed down with a slow, irresistible force, driving Martin beneath the surface, holding him under despite his frantic, desperate struggles. Without conscious decision, some primal survival instinct overriding everything else, Carl let go of the railing. Staying near the capsized boat meant certain death. He had to get away. He had to swim for his life. He struck out into the darkness, away from the ghastly green light, away from the creatures, swimming with desperate, adrenaline-fueled strokes that carried him up the faces of waves and down into the troughs. He did not look back. He could not bear to see what was happening to Martin. He could not process the reality that his entire crew had been systematically, brutally murdered in the most horrible way imaginable. He swam until his arms felt like lead, until his legs would barely kick, until the profound cold had penetrated even the thick layers of his dry suit, and his core temperature was dropping into the dangerous territory of severe hypothermia. The storm raged around him, indifferent to his struggle. Waves lifted him high and dropped him low, and the rain pelted his face until it was numb. Behind him, the searchlights from the capsized motor lifeboat grew dimmer and dimmer as the boat sank deeper, until they were finally extinguished, leaving him in absolute darkness. Ahead, there was only more darkness and the certain crushing knowledge that he was going to die out here, alone in the ocean, a victim of exposure, if not of the creatures that had destroyed his boat and murdered his crew. But he kept swimming. It was all he could do. To give up meant sinking beneath the waves right now, and some stubborn, defiant part of Carl Powell refused to quit, even when death seemed not just likely, but inevitable. His mind, starved of warmth and oxygen, began to fragment. His thoughts became disjointed, strange. He found himself thinking about his daughter's birthday party 3 weeks ago, about the way she had laughed when she opened his present, a model of a Coast Guard helicopter. He remembered the chocolate cake with pink frosting that his wife had made. These thoughts, these small, perfect memories, seemed more real than the raging ocean around him, more solid than the waves and the wind. Something brushed against his leg beneath the water. Carl's fragmented thoughts snapped back to a terrible, razor-sharp focus. Adrenaline, the body's last reserve, surged through his system, giving him a burst of energy he should not have possessed. He kicked frantically, expecting at any moment to feel those massive hands close around him, to be pulled down into the depths like Tommy and Martin. But the contact did not repeat. Maybe it had been a piece of debris or a clump of seaweed, or maybe nothing at all, a phantom touch conjured by his terrified mind. But Carl was certain it had been one of the creatures, stalking him beneath the surface, toying with him before the kill. He had lost all sense of direction, all sense of time. He had no idea if he was swimming toward shore or further out to sea, and it no longer mattered. He could not survive much longer regardless. His strokes were growing weaker, his kicks less frequent. The profound cold was becoming almost comfortable now, a gentle numbness spreading through his limbs, which some distant, rational part of his mind recognized as a very bad sign, the beginning of hypothermia's final fatal stages. He stopped swimming and just floated for a moment, riding the waves, his life's energy spent. He thought about his wife, Sarah, and his daughter, Emma, and his son, Michael. He hoped they would somehow know that he had died trying to save people, that he had not given up, that he had fought until there was nothing left to fight with. The wave that lifted him seemed larger than the others, a massive, mountainous swell that raised him high above the surrounding chaos. At its peak, for just a moment, Carl saw lights in the distance, multiple white lights arranged in a pattern that his dulled, dying mind eventually recognized as a ship. He tried to shout, but his voice was a barely audible croak. He tried to wave, but his arms, heavy as stone, would not lift above the water. He was certain the ship would pass him by, would never see one man's head bobbing in the vast, storm-tossed ocean. But the wave carried him forward, and then another and another. The lights were getting closer. With a surge of disbelief, Carl realized that the current was carrying him toward the ship, not away from it. Pure, blind chance and the storm's chaotic water movements were giving him one last, impossible opportunity. It was a commercial fishing vessel, a large trawler of the kind that worked the deep waters far offshore. He could see crew members moving on the deck, could see them pointing at something in the water. He used the last dregs of his strength to splash and make noise, to draw their attention. A spotlight swept across the waves, missed him, swept back, and then found him, pinning him in its brilliant beam. Then there were voices shouting, life rings being thrown, and a rescue swimmer hitting the water. Strong hands grabbed him, and he was being pulled toward the ship, toward light, towards safety, towards survival. They hauled him aboard and stripped off the ruined dry suit. They wrapped him in thick emergency blankets and carried him into the heated cabin. Carl's body began to shake uncontrollably as it fought to generate warmth, his teeth chattering so hard he thought they might break. The fishing vessel's captain, a man with a weathered face and kind eyes, was asking questions, trying to understand what had happened. Carl tried to answer, but the words would not come properly. His numbed lips and frozen thoughts made communication almost impossible. He managed to convey that his boat had sunk, that his crew was dead, that they needed to search the area. But when the captain asked what had caused the sinking, Carl found himself unable to speak the truth. Who would believe him? Who would accept that a United States Coast Guard motor lifeboat had been systematically destroyed by creatures that shouldn't exist? That his highly trained professional crew had been killed by monsters that looked like Sasquatch or Bigfoot or whatever name people gave to the things in blurry photographs and late-night television shows? Carl's mind, even in its hypothermic, traumatized state, understood with perfect clarity that telling the truth would make him sound insane. It would raise questions about his mental stability, potentially end his career, and mark him as an unreliable witness for the rest of his life. So when the captain pressed for details, Carl said there had been a collision with submerged debris, that the boat had capsized in the heavy seas, that he didn't know what had happened to his crew. It was a plausible lie, a tragedy of the sea. The fishing vessel searched the area for 2 hours, crisscrossing the coordinates in a standard rescue pattern, but they found nothing. No survivors, no bodies, no wreckage beyond a few floating pieces of equipment that might have come from the motor lifeboat or might have come from anywhere. The creatures were gone, vanished back into the depths as completely as if they had never existed. Carl watched the searchlights play across the empty, heaving water and knew that no one would ever believe what had really happened, that he was the sole witness to something the world insisted was impossible. They took him back to shore, where paramedics rushed him to the hospital. He spent 2 days being treated for severe hypothermia and exposure. Lieutenant Commander Brennan visited him in his hospital room. Her face was drawn with grief and stress, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. She asked him to tell her everything that had happened from the beginning. Carl opened his mouth to tell the truth, to describe the impossible creature on the debris, the attack, the others in the water, the way they had torn through the boat's hull. But something stopped him, some deep-seated instinct for self-preservation, for a life that could continue in the normal world, took over. Instead, he stuck to the story he had concocted. The collision with debris, the sudden capsizing, the chaos of the storm. Brennan's eyes searched his face, and Carl had the distinct sense that she knew he wasn't telling her everything, that she could see the profound trauma and terror lurking behind his carefully chosen, sterile words. But she didn't push. She told him that Derek's body had been recovered by another Coast Guard vessel, found floating in his life jacket 3 miles from where the motor lifeboat had gone down. The coroner's report cited the cause of death as drowning, but noted extensive blunt force trauma, including a broken neck and a crushed chest, as if something enormous had squeezed the life out of him. Tommy and Martin were still missing, presumed drowned, their bodies likely dragged down by the current or trapped in the wreckage of the boat at the bottom of the sea. The official investigation concluded that motor lifeboat 47-225 had suffered a catastrophic hull breach resulting from a collision with storm debris. It stated that the crew had performed admirably in attempting to rescue a person stranded on floating wreckage, that the extreme weather conditions had contributed to the tragedy, and that the loss of 3 highly trained Coast Guard personnel was a regrettable but unavoidable accident, not the result of negligence or error. The report made no mention of creatures, of attacks, of anything that could not be explained by weather and bad luck. Carl read through it, his hand trembling slightly, and signed the documents. He said nothing to contradict the official findings. What evidence did he have? The motor lifeboat was at the bottom of the ocean. The debris the creature had been clinging to was gone, swallowed by the sea. His crew members, the only ones who might have corroborated his impossible account, were dead. It was Carl's word alone against the entire weight of rational skepticism. It was not enough. It would never be enough. He understood that speaking the truth would accomplish nothing except to destroy his credibility and cast a shadow of doubt on everything else in his report. He was placed on mandatory leave for 6 weeks and required to attend counseling sessions with a psychologist who specialized in trauma related to rescue operations. Carl went through the motions. He answered the questions. He described his feelings of guilt, loss, and survivor's remorse, but he never spoke about what he had really seen. He never mentioned the amber eyes, the terrible stench, or the cold, coordinated intelligence he had witnessed in those creatures' attack. The psychologist eventually cleared him for return to duty, noting in her report that Petty Officer Powell had experienced a significant traumatic event, but appeared to be processing it in a healthy and constructive manner. Carl went back to work at the Coos Bay station, back to the same operations room where he had received the orders that had sent his crew to their deaths, back to the same equipment room where they had suited up for their final mission. The Coast Guard provided a new motor lifeboat to replace the one that had been lost. Carl stood on its pristine deck and felt the ghosts of his dead crewmates all around him. He heard Tommy's young voice calling out from the searchlight position, saw Derek emerging from the equipment locker with the flare gun, watched Martin calmly plotting courses on the navigation station. The memories were a constant, silent torment. He served for another 3 years, a hollowed-out version of the man he had once been, before requesting a transfer to a desk job at the district headquarters in Seattle. He could no longer face another storm rescue, another emergency call, another chance of encountering something in the dark water that rational minds insisted could not exist. His wife noticed the change in him, the way he would wake from nightmares, screaming about things in the ocean. She saw the way he refused to go to the beach with the family anymore, the way he would sometimes stare at nothing for long minutes, an expression of haunted, abject terror on his face. Carl never told her the truth either. He could not burden her with the knowledge of what was really out there in the deep water off the Oregon coast, what swam beneath the waves and climbed onto storm debris and attacked Coast Guard vessels with a terrifying, coordinated intelligence. That knowledge was his alone to carry, a weight that grew heavier with each passing year. Each night, he lay awake remembering the sound of Tommy's bones breaking, the sight of Martin being pushed beneath the surface, the feeling of his friend Derek's body thudding into the wheelhouse. He began to collect news reports of strange sightings along the Pacific coast, articles about fishermen who reported seeing something massive swimming near their boats, hikers who claimed to have spotted large, bipedal creatures near the waterline, beachcombers who found enormous footprints in the sand that could not be explained by any known animal. Carl compiled these reports in a folder he kept hidden in his home office, adding to it whenever he found a new account. Sometimes, late at night, he would spread the papers across his desk and study them, and wonder if anyone else had seen what he had seen, if anyone else carried the same impossible, soul-crushing knowledge. The official records listed the loss of motor lifeboat 47-225 as a weather-related accident. The deaths of Petty Officers Derek Simmons, Martin Fisher, and Tommy Vasquez remained line-of-duty casualties from a vessel sinking during storm rescue operations. There was no mention of creatures or attacks, no acknowledgement that something existed in the ocean that should not exist, no warning to future crews that they might encounter something far more dangerous than weather or mechanical failure. Carl attended the memorial services for his fallen crew members. He stood beside their grieving families, accepted their thanks for trying to save them, and felt the weight of his secrets pressing down on him like a physical burden. He shook hands with Derek's widow and looked into her tear-filled eyes, and he could not tell her that her husband had died a hero, protecting his crew from a monster, that his last act had been one of incredible courage, that he had fought something straight from a nightmare to buy his teammates a few more seconds of life. She believed her husband had drowned when the boat capsized, a terrible tragedy, but an understandable one. Carl let her keep that belief because the truth would serve no purpose except to multiply her pain, to add the horror of the incomprehensible to the sorrow of her loss. The years passed. Carl's career with the Coast Guard eventually came to an end. He retired at age 55 with full benefits, a stack of commendations, and a ceremony where they thanked him for his long and dedicated service. He and his wife moved to a small town in eastern Oregon, far from the coast, far from the ocean, far from any body of water larger than a creek. He took up woodworking in his retirement, spending hours in his garage workshop building furniture and birdhouses, anything to keep his hands busy and his mind occupied with something other than the memories. But the memories never truly left him. They were always there, waiting in the quiet moments, in the space between waking and sleeping, in the sound of rain on the roof that reminded him of waves against a hull, in the deep dark of night when shadows moved in ways that made his pulse quicken. Carl would sometimes stand at his bedroom window and look out at the clear, star-filled night sky, so different from the storm-racked chaos of that November evening. And he would remember the amber eyes glowing in the searchlights, the massive hands reaching for his crew, the terrible alien intelligence that had coordinated the attack on his boat. He never went public with his story. He never called the newspapers or the television stations or the people who made documentaries about cryptids and unexplained phenomena. What would be the point? His account would be picked apart by skeptics, dismissed as the delusions of a traumatized man, used as cheap entertainment by people who collected such stories like trading cards. Without evidence, without corroboration, without any physical proof, his testimony was nothing but words. And words alone could not overcome the powerful, fundamental human need to believe that the world made sense, that the laws of nature were fixed and immutable, that creatures like the ones Carl had encountered could not possibly exist. So he carried his knowledge alone, a terrible secret that isolated him even from the people he loved most. His wife and children knew that something had changed in him after that November storm, but they could never understand the full, crushing weight of what he had experienced. He grew old with that secret, watching his hair turn gray and his face line with wrinkles, feeling his body slow down with the passage of years. But the memories stayed sharp and clear, preserved in perfect, horrifying detail by the trauma that had burned them into his consciousness. On the 10th anniversary of the motor lifeboat's sinking, Carl drove alone back to the Oregon coast, back to Coos Bay, and he stood on the shore looking out at the gray water stretching to the horizon. The ocean was calm that day, gentle waves lapping at the sand, a stark, peaceful contrast to the storm-tossed chaos of his last mission. He tried to reconcile this tranquil scene with his memories of that night, tried to believe that somewhere out there, beneath those placid waters, swam creatures that defied explanation, that killed without mercy, that possessed an intelligence that made them infinitely more terrifying than any simple animal. A young couple walked past him on the beach, laughing together, splashing in the shallow water at the tide line, completely unaware that they were playing at the edge of an ocean that held horrors they could not possibly imagine. Carl watched them and felt a vast, unbridgeable gulf open between himself and these innocent people, the gulf between those who knew the truth and those who were afforded the luxury of ignorance. He wanted to call out to them, to warn them, to tell them to get away from the water, but he knew how that would sound. He knew they would see only a crazy old man shouting about monsters. He stood there until the sun began to set, watching the light fade across the Pacific. Then he turned and walked back to his car and drove away from the coast for what he knew would be the last time. He had come seeking some kind of closure, some way to make peace with what had happened, but he found only the same questions that had haunted him for a decade. What were those creatures? Where did they come from? How many of them were out there in the deep water? Did they attack other ships, other crews, leaving no survivors to tell the tale? Would anyone ever believe the truth, even if Carl stood on a rooftop and shouted it to the world? The questions had no answers, or at least no answers that Carl would ever find. He accepted that reality as he drove back to his landlocked home in eastern Oregon. His story would die with him, destined to become nothing more than another unconfirmed report in the vast, strange catalogue of cryptid sightings and monster encounters that filled books and websites and late-night conversations among believers. Derek and Martin and Tommy would remain listed as victims of a maritime accident, their true cause of death unknown to everyone except the one man who had witnessed it and survived. Carl Powell lived for another 15 years after that final visit to the coast. In all that time, he never spoke the truth about what had happened on that November night when the motor lifeboat went down. He took his secret to his grave when he died at the age of 70. His wife and children gathered around his hospital bed, holding his hands as cancer finally claimed him, succeeding where the ocean had failed. His last conscious thought was not of his family or his life or the heaven he hoped awaited him, but of amber eyes glowing in the stark light of a search beam, of massive shapes moving through dark, violent water, of creatures that existed in the liminal space between myth and reality, their existence known only to the dead and to one man who had carried their terrible secret to his final breath. The official records never changed. The loss of motor lifeboat 47-225 remained attributed to storm damage and a collision with debris. The deaths of 3 Coast Guard personnel remained attributed to drowning during a vessel sinking. No mention was ever made of creatures or attacks or anything that could not be explained by weather and waves. The ocean kept its secrets, as it had always done, as it would continue to do long after the last person who remembered Carl Powell had themselves passed into history. And somewhere in the deep cold water off the Oregon coast, in the crushing black depths where light never penetrates and pressure pulverizes anything not adapted to that brutal environment, the creatures that had destroyed the motor lifeboat continued their existence, whatever that existence might be, unknown and unseen by the world of humans who built their fragile boats and sailed their vast oceans and told themselves with comforting certainty that they understood the natural world. They swam and hunted and lived according to rules and patterns that Carl had glimpsed only briefly before survival became his sole focus. And they remained invisible to science and skepticism alike, their reality confirmed only by the nightmares of one old man who died without ever speaking their name aloud.